When he was 15, they laughed at his dreams. His grades were low, his confidence shattered, and one teacher's voice stayed with him more than any lesson. "You're not going anywhere in life." That sentence followed him for years, lingering, like a shadow. But what they never expected was that the boy they dismissed would return, not as a failure, but as a guest lecturer, in the very same classroom, with students now hanging on to his every word. Sometimes life doesn't just prove people wrong, it brings them back to the place they were broken, just to show how far they've come. He didn't stand out, not in the way students are usually remembered. He wasn't the loud one, or the funny one, or even the one teachers counted on for the right answer. He was the boy in the back row, the one who rarely raised his hand, who stared out the window when no one was watching, and who kept his hoodie up even when it wasn't cold. His report card didn't inspire confidence. 2 failing grades, 1 borderline pass, more absences than anyone cared to count. Teachers called him distracted. Some said he was lazy, others didn't say anything at all. He wasn't the kind of student who got second chances. He was the kind that quietly slipped through the cracks, right where no one had to notice. But what they didn't know was what waited for him outside of school. A home that wasn't whole. A father who vanished before he hit double digits, and a mother who worked night shifts and came home too tired to ask how his day went. Bills piled up on a table no one ate at. Dinner was whatever he could microwave. And sleep? That came in short bursts, between arguments in the hallway and police sirens outside the window. He came to school not because he was hungry to learn, but because he was just hungry. Some days the cafeteria tray was the only real meal he had. Still, he showed up. Late, sometimes. Quiet, always. And then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't during a fight or an exam or some dramatic confrontation. It was during a routine math class, the kind where the clock seemed to move slower than the lesson. He'd forgotten his homework. Again. His mind had been elsewhere the night before, helping his little sister with a nosebleed that wouldn't stop and trying to figure out how to stretch $10 across 3 days. The teacher didn't ask why. He just sighed, looked at him, and said in front of the whole class, "You'll never succeed if you keep this up. Some people just don't have what it takes." That sentence didn't come with shouting. It came with silence, and it cut deeper than any insult ever had. Not because it was cruel, but because it confirmed what he was starting to believe about himself. That maybe they were right, maybe he really wasn't going anywhere. The classroom stayed quiet for a few seconds, then moved on. But he didn't. Those words stuck. They followed him out of that room, down the hallway, and all the way home. For weeks, they echoed in his head every time he messed up or hesitated. "You'll never succeed. You don't have what it takes." But something else happened, too. A shift, so small, even he didn't recognize it at first. The words hurt, but they also sparked something. Not defiance, not revenge, just a deep, buried hunger to be more than what people assumed. He didn't know how he'd do it. He didn't even know when. But that moment planted something in him. A seed that would grow slowly, through failure and frustration and doubt. Because sometimes, what pushes a person forward isn't encouragement. It's the pain of being written off too early. And deep down, even if he couldn't prove it yet, he wasn't ready to be forgotten. For a while he believed what they said. Maybe not all at once, but slowly. Day by day, those words started to feel like facts. Every missed assignment felt like proof. Every failed quiz, every skipped class, every silent walk home just confirmed it more. He didn't wake up one morning and give up. It happened gradually. First, he stopped trying. Then, he stopped showing up. And before long, he wasn't a student anymore. No one called to ask where he'd gone. No one chased him down. He simply disappeared from the system, and the system moved on without him. At 16, he was out of school and scrubbing pans in the back of a cheap diner, surrounded by the smell of grease and the sound of orders being yelled through a broken speaker. He worked long hours, barely spoke to anyone, and avoided looking in mirrors. Mirrors had a way of reminding you of everything you hadn't become. Most nights he came home exhausted, clothes smelling like fried onions, hands red from soap and steam. There was no sense of direction, only the blur of surviving. Rent had to be paid. Groceries had to be bought, and no one had time to ask if he was okay. He was young, but life had aged him early, and deep inside, he started to wonder if this was it, if this was all there was going to be. The future had once felt far away, like something waiting in the distance. Now it felt sealed off, like a door already closed. Then came the moment that changed things, not with noise, but with silence. One night during a late shift, while on a short break, he sat alone in the cramped break room. Someone had left a book behind. It was worn, dog-eared, the kind of book that had clearly been passed from hand to hand. Out of boredom, or maybe instinct, he opened it. It was a biography about someone who had failed repeatedly, been rejected, doubted, ridiculed, until they built something incredible. Page after page he read about mistakes, setbacks, rock-bottom moments, and how none of them were final. And, somewhere between those lines, something shifted inside him. Not a lightning bolt, not a grand epiphany, just a quiet, powerful realization. No one was going to come save him. If he wanted a different story, he'd have to write it himself. He didn't quit his job the next day. He didn't become a straight-A student overnight. But that moment planted a decision. One he didn't announce to anyone. He would go back, he would try again. This time, not for teachers, not for approval, not even to silence the voices that had doubted him. This time, it would be for himself. For the kid who'd once been told he wouldn't succeed. For the version of himself that deserved more than minimum wage and silent failure. He started with night school, signed up for a few basic classes, and picked up used textbooks from a thrift shop. He studied after his shifts, took notes during breaks, and forced himself to ask questions in class, even when his voice shook. It was uncomfortable. It was slow. It was humbling. But every time he learned something new, every time he passed a quiz or finished a paper, he felt something rebuild inside him. Confidence didn't come fast, but it came. And with it came a new kind of hunger. Not just to survive, but to grow. Not to prove the world wrong, but to prove to himself that he was worth the effort. Progress didn't come in a straight line. There were no big wins, no sudden breakthroughs that changed everything overnight. It was slow, frustrating, and filled with setbacks. He failed some of his first night classes. Concepts that seemed simple to others often took him hours to grasp. There were times when he questioned if he was even capable of catching up. But what made the difference this time was that he didn't walk away. Each failure wasn't the end. It was just a sign to try again with a little more understanding. For the first time in his life, he was learning how to learn, even if it meant staying up after midnight with tired eyes and a second-hand textbook, rereading the same page 3 times before it made sense. He wasn't aiming for perfection. He just didn't want to quit on himself anymore. When he finally passed the GED exam, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that he could reclaim what had once felt permanently lost. That small victory gave him the confidence to take a bigger step, enrolling in community college. He started part-time, unsure if he could balance work and classes. Money was still tight, and doubts still whispered in his mind, but he kept going. He made it through his first semester, then another. Slowly, his confidence grew. So did his grades. He went from avoiding participation to asking questions, from feeling invisible to being the student others turned to for help. There was no applause, no spotlight, but inside, something was shifting. He was starting to believe in himself. Everything changed when he met a professor who saw him, not just as a student, but as a person with potential. This professor never asked about his past, never mentioned how late he'd started, or how far behind he'd once been. He only cared about where he could go next. That kind of belief was new. It stuck with him. And it planted a new thought. What if he could be that person for someone else? What if, instead of just getting through life, he could use his story to change someone else's? That's when the idea of becoming a teacher took root. At first, it sounded ridiculous. He'd barely gotten through school himself. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Who better to reach kids who felt forgotten than someone who had been there? Who better to tell a struggling student that they mattered than someone who had once sat in silence, believing they didn't? So he changed his major to education. It was harder than anything he'd done before. The coursework was demanding. The student teaching assignments were exhausting. But every time he stood in front of a classroom, something felt right. He wasn't just passing tests anymore. He was stepping into purpose. After years of grinding, he transferred to a university. He juggled part-time jobs, night shifts, and endless assignments, but he never gave up. Because this wasn't just about getting a degree. It was about building a future from the ruins of what he was once told he'd never become. He still remembered those words. "You'll never succeed." But now, they didn't haunt him. They pushed him, not out of spite, but as a reminder of how far he'd come. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong anymore. He was finally proving himself right. The message came as a surprise. It had been years since he'd walked the halls of that school. Years since he sat in those chairs, staring at clocks that never seemed to move. He hadn't expected to hear from them, not after everything. Yet there it was, in his inbox. A polite, professional email from a new vice principal inviting him to speak during an upcoming student event. They were hosting a series on resilience, and his name had come up. The irony wasn't lost on him. The school that once gave up on him now wanted him to inspire others. He sat with that feeling for a while, not bitterness, not pride, just quiet reflection. It wasn't revenge he felt. It was closure. He agreed without hesitation, not because he wanted recognition, but because he knew there were students sitting in those same classrooms who felt the way he once did, unseen, unheard, and uncertain about their place in the world. He didn't come to boast or paint over the hard parts. He came to be honest, to show what it looks like when you fail, stumble, and choose to try again anyway. Walking through those halls again brought back memories he thought he'd buried. The chipped paint on the lockers, the hum of fluorescent lights, the echo of shoes in an empty corridor, it all came flooding back. But this time, he wasn't walking in as a kid who didn't belong. He was walking in as someone who had earned his place. The classroom was packed. Students leaned forward with curiosity, some expecting just another talk. But as he began to speak, their attention shifted. He didn't tell them about perfect grades or effortless success. He told them the truth, about dropping out, about working in kitchens, about being told he'd never make it, and how, for a while, he believed it. Then he spoke about what changed, how deciding to try again, quietly and consistently, had rewritten the story he once thought was finished. He watched. As heads nodded, eyes softened, and walls came down. They weren't hearing a speech. They were hearing someone who had lived the things they were still trying to survive. In the back of the room sat someone he didn't expect, the teacher who once told him he wouldn't succeed. Older now, no longer leading the classroom, but still present, watching. Their eyes met briefly. There was no tension, no confrontation, just a shared recognition of what had been and what was now. He didn't need an apology. He didn't carry anger anymore. What he carried was the satisfaction of knowing he had done what no one expected. He had returned, not as a reminder of failure, but as living proof of what was possible when someone refuses to stay broken. As the session ended, students lined up, not for autographs or photos, but to ask questions, to share pieces of themselves, to say thank you. They weren't inspired by perfection. They were moved by honesty. And he stood there, answering each one, patient and present, the way he wished someone had been for him all those years ago. In that moment, he realized something. Success wasn't about titles or paychecks. It was about being the person he once needed. And now that he was, nothing about that classroom felt small anymore. He didn't hold back. He spoke openly about the years he'd stumbled through failure, not as dramatic turning points, but as ordinary moments that added up. Missed deadlines, silent panic attacks, the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being overlooked. He told them how he once thought failure meant you weren't good enough, when in reality, it often just meant you hadn't figured things out yet. He talked about the nights he stayed awake wondering if he was wasting his time, the days he walked into classrooms feeling like an outsider, and the jobs he worked where no one bothered to learn his name. But instead of framing those moments as things to regret, he explained how they became his training ground, how the hardest parts of his journey taught him the most about resilience, discipline, and the power of keeping a promise to yourself. He told the students something they rarely hear, that it's okay to feel lost, that it's okay to fall behind, that success doesn't always come fast, and it doesn't always come loud. It often looks like silence, like doing the right thing, when no one's watching, like choosing to show up even when no one expects you to. He shared how small choices, reading an extra page asking for help, staying 10 more minutes, had slowly reshaped his path. He didn't offer shortcuts. He offered truth, and that truth landed differently. There were no flashy slogans, just the quiet, grounded voice of someone who had lived what he was talking about. When the bell rang to dismiss the class, no one moved. The students stayed seated, their notebooks forgotten, their attention still locked on the man who had just poured his story into the room. Some of them saw themselves in him. Others saw a sibling, a friend, or someone they'd almost become. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of something else, a kind of stillness that only comes when people are processing something real. A few students came up afterward, not to compliment him, but to connect. They asked how he kept going, how he stopped feeling like a failure, how he knew when things would finally turn around. And to each one he gave an honest answer. You don't always know. You just keep going anyway. He left that day without applause or fanfare, but he walked out of that school lighter than he had ever entered it. There was no need for revenge, no hunger to prove anything to those who doubted him. He had already won, not because of a title or a paycheck or a degree hanging on his wall, but because he had become the person he needed when he was younger. Someone who didn't just survive the system, but returned to it with purpose. Someone who had learned that real success isn't loud, but lasting. And as he walked through the doors, he heard footsteps behind him. Students catching up, wanting to ask more, not about where he came from, but about how they could move forward too. That was the victory. That was the legacy. He didn't change the world in one speech, but he lit a spark in a few young hearts who needed to hear that it's never too late to start. And that was enough.